Tonight, in order to move forward, we gotta go back. To begin with, I'm gonna dredge some stuff we covered in older episodes, starting with the concept of a 7 out of 10 game. Most of us have played a few of these. A game that's neither great nor terrible, slightly better than average, it's perfectly playable, and you might even have fun with it here and there, but overall, it's not reinventing the wheel or doing anything that's going to get people especially excited about playing it, at least not an avid gamer that's seen the same thing 1,000 times before. Now, you might recall, we talked in passing a while ago about an IGN article titled, "Long Average Games Have Value Too," the writing of which coincided with Forspoken, a game whose combat I thought was awesome, but whose open world and story was extremely lacking. But the poster child of this topic was the then PS4 exclusive Days Gone, a game I've put down and picked back up like 3 separate times because it is in fact a very long 6 or 7 out of 10 game. Nothing surprising about dropping a game like that, right? But here's the shocker. I finally finished it.
Everybody's gone to bed and sleep battled. We're up all night instead. Games and movies are our sweet reveries. We present 3 a.m. Soliloquies.
Alright, we did it. Anybody actually want to be here?
Most things that I love aren't perfect. Go ahead and try to say that sentence out loud for yourselves. Seriously, try it. I'll wait. So if you struggled with that, you might be falling into the increasingly common fallacy of all-encompassing polarization. Humans, I think we can all agree, are pretty stupid. Critical thinking, forming our own opinions, that's too hard, so most people just wait for somebody else to tell them what to think. What this leads to is almost every belief or opinion getting turned into one gigantic game of this versus that. No room for nuance or shades of gray, just everything in these big, drab strokes of black and white. And from the biggest world stages to the tiniest, pettiest Reddit arguments, it seems like you're only ever allowed to feel one of 2 ways about anything. And this extends to gaming opinions. Everything's either an infallible masterpiece or the worst piece of garbage you've ever come across in your entire life. And I'm not the first person to talk about this. So I just spent a few weeks playing through a game that even its die-hard, most passionate fans are going to agree is extremely, extremely flawed. Up to this point, I've always said that the most flawed game that I feel really strongly about is Final Fantasy XV, but honestly, we might have a new contender. Because even though Days Gone is undeniably, indisputably, unbelievably far from being a masterpiece, I still really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it so much that I would recommend it to someone whose tastes I felt it was probably in line with. And I want to talk about that, because I feel like it's way too many people who only feel like 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 experiences are the only ones worth having. And that's just not true to me. On its best day, this game is an 8 out of 10, and on its worst, it's like a 6, but I still feel like it's absolutely worth playing. What I want to talk about is why I put the game down so many times, what made me come back to it, where its flaws are, and how, in spite of everything that's wrong with it, I still came away really feeling like I had a valuable experience.
What do you suppose that feels like? Huh? Torn apart? Eaten alive? Guess he's gonna find out. Fuck you.
So the 2 biggest things that characterize the gameplay, which we're going to talk about individually, are the gameplay loop structure and the hordes. Days Gone is a survival horror game set in an open world, which on paper sounds like an interesting concept, but the problem is that the more you play through it, the more you start to see why survival horror is usually going to be set in a more linear environment. The genre is very often slower paced and focused on resource conservation and strategic use, and resources being limited help to streamline the experience while also enhancing the tension, so it all fits together. Look at any of the tautly paced survival horror games of the last, decade, I could point to Outlast, I could point to Soma, but Days Gone being in an open world structures the game such that things like tension and resource scarcity, they're no longer really factors. There's still ammo scarcity, like your clip sizes at the beginning of the game are not going to be large enough to take on stronger enemies or more enemies. Your weapons aren't powerful enough to deal, but in the end it doesn't end up mattering much because since it's an open world, you can kind of just go out and grind for resources however often you want. And there's not really a reason not to do that. In fact, the game kind of encourages you to do that, which we'll talk more about later, but really the only thing that inhibits resource acquisition is time. Now again, this is another thing that's pretty common for survival games. You look at something like Subnautica or No Man's Sky, things like crafting and gathering are usually going to take a certain amount of real-world time. Because the genre is about patience and resource acquisition and slowly building things up over time, so you don't want everything to be like an instant gratification. But the problem with doing this in Days Gone is that this is a long game, like really long and very involved. So a lot of the things that you take for granted in a typical survival horror setting, here it almost feels like a way of just kind of artificially extending how long the game takes to play. And this is the single biggest criticism I have about this entire game, because you can feel it everywhere. I mean, to name a few examples, the fact that it takes some time to gather things, the fact that you have to get off of your bike to get resources. And I understand that those things are in place so that there's still a sense of peril, like you don't know if you're going to be attacked by something while you're doing these things. And to be fair, sometimes that gameplay mechanic works out pretty well. I've had some genuinely fun experiences in the game with random enemy encounters because the game's constantly throwing different things at you out of nowhere. So you do sometimes have to think on your feet with surprise enemy encounters that you weren't expecting, and that is fun. But still, very often it boils down to this thing of either you're going to run around on foot to grind, or you have to constantly get on and off the bike to do it. And I think we can agree that both of those things are kind of annoying. Now, earlier I mentioned that the game kind of encourages you to grind, and that is because your primary adversary in this game comes in the form of gigantic zombie hordes. The hordes are the second big thing that characterize the gameplay of Days Gone, and structurally, they are the primary thing that sets this game apart from a typical open world and or survival horror experience. A lot of times in survival horror games, the emphasis is going to be on stealth. You're trying to survive, so the easiest way to do that is to just take yourself out of harm's way. Yeah, you can probably take out a few from stealth via bombs or lures, sniper rifles, but through some kind of supernatural, weird daredevil radar sense, once you kill a few, the rest of them are going to clock your position and rush you, so you can't stealth your way through these encounters. And since you have to fight them openly and you're one guy, what that means is you have to go in armed to the teeth. And in order to arm yourself to the teeth, you guessed it, have to grind for resources out in camps and in the world. Now, granted, you only have to fight a few of these hordes to beat the game. I want to say like 3, but one of the ones you have to fight is the biggest horde in the entire game, and so it is the most substantial challenge you could possibly encounter. Plus, if you're a completionist like me, there's like 40 hordes in the game, and obviously you're going to have to do a lot of grinding to get through those. Now, the horde fights themselves are mechanically really interesting, because since you're not just dealing with a bunch of enemies who are kind of hanging back and selectively choosing when they're going to attack you. No, it's just hundreds, thousands of guys rushing you at the same time. You have to think about crowd control and positioning. You have to navigate through choke points. Maybe you set traps beforehand. Hunting the hordes and fighting the hordes is, everybody agrees, the most interesting and exciting part about the gameplay of Days Gone. So even though I have brought up the hordes as a means of talking about how the game encourages you to resource grind, the hordes are also the best part of the game. So this is probably the first point at which we find ourselves comparing the good with the bad. The good is that the horde fights are awesome, very exciting, very cool. But the bad is that in order to get through them, you do have to do a certain amount of grinding. That is not fun in this game. And before you tell me that grinding can't possibly be fun, I've done more than one video on this channel about Monster Hunter, so go check those out. Now, while we're on the topic of things taking longer than they need to, let's talk about this game's fast travel system. The checkpoints are spaced too far apart. Pretty much anywhere you go in the world, you're going to have to do at least another minute of driving from the fast travel point that you selected to get to where you're trying to go. And that's doubly strange because the open world in this game is very small. Which is not a bad thing. A small open world can be 1,000 times more exciting than one that's way too big, but it does beg the question of, if the world is so small, then why am I spending so much time doing this pointless driving? Though the driving itself is mechanically very satisfying. Especially once you upgrade your bike, you can make it go faster, you get these nitrous pods that you can use to boost over jumps. Some of those jumps actually end up being necessary to find some collectibles, so you have to do some creative environmental driving. So mechanically, the bike is fun. And ultimately, upgrading the bike does feel rewarding. And while we're on the topic of rewarding upgrades, let's talk a little bit about upgrading your character, Deacon St. John. I think most gamers can agree that for any game where the point is you getting stronger, it's important that the game nails that sense of progression. You want to really feel your character getting more and more capable and being able to do things that they didn't used to be able to do. Now, there's plenty of games where the difficulty ramps up, but your character's not getting stronger. Old school platformers come to mind, Jak and Daxter comes to mind. But for a lot of games, it's this sort of power fantasy where you're building up your guy to the point where at the end of the game, they're a walking army and literally nothing can take you down. And it's cool because even though we're in a more realistic setting with this game, you still get that, and you get it really well in Days Gone. The progression really reminds me a lot of The Last of Us 2 in that it's mostly centered around your crafting recipes and the new weapons you can build for yourself, but you do actually get character upgrades as well in the form of a skill tree that comes with leveling up, and you can also get boosts to your health, your stamina, and your focus at these different spots around the world.
They're just what the doctor ordered.
But the main centerpiece of the progression is the new weapons. At the start of the game, all you have is like this shitty little pistol, a crossbow, I think maybe you have a sniper rifle that's not very good, and your boot knife, which is your only melee weapon at the start of the game. But eventually you get grenades, flashbangs, pipe bombs, remote bombs, landmines, all kinds of crazy shit. And all this stuff lets you take the fight to your enemies in a way that would have been like unimaginable at the beginning of the game. So after being so small and so weak in the zombie apocalypse for so long, it really is awesome to just run around blowing the shit out of everybody, deleting waves of zombies. It's great. And that's another part of why horde hunting is so much fun in this game, because it really serves to drive home just how much stronger you've gotten. And it's something that also plays into the story, which we'll talk about later. So the game does have a really nice power progression, but unfortunately it does not have a good enemy roster to go with it. Now, you can broadly divide the threats you're going to face in this game into 3 categories. There's your human enemies, which includes marauders, rippers, anarchists, any enemies that use melee weapons and shoot at you. You've got your wildlife, which includes things like bears and wolves, and those are the only forms of wildlife that actually attack you, so I'm not even going to mention the other ones. And finally, you've got your zombies, right, which they call freakers in universe. Now, like other games I can think of that have this kind of division of enemy types, like in Infamous 2, the type of enemy that's going to have the most variety is the most monstrous type, which in this game is of course the zombies. You start by seeing like the basic swarmers that move in the hordes, but as the game goes on you do start to see certain new varieties. You get breakers, which are big and brolic, screamers, which can stun you and they summon these other guys. You even start to see some infected animals like wolves that run really fast, bears that are massive and really strong. Even the fucking crows get infected and start dive bombing you in swarms at the end of the game. So you do start to see some new stuff as the game goes on. Even though in its early hours, all you really see are the basic zombies and humans, and that can get boring kind of quick. And wolves. Wolves as well. And you might say, oh well, that sounds like decent enemy variety, but the problem is that unlike Infamous 2, none of the enemies really are all that different. Like, even when you start seeing new zombies, they don't really act all that different. Like, the first thing you see are the swarmers, right? Then you see the newts, which are the little ones that kind of jump at you, which is not that exciting, but it is different. Then you get bleachers, which are just stronger versions of the swarmers and don't behave differently at all. Lame. Then you get the runners, which are just infected wolves and act exactly the same, only they're faster. Lame. The first enemy type that you see that's actually drastically different is the breaker, which like runs at you and throws punches, so at least it's a different fight, but it's not that different. Then of course there's the screamer, which kind of just stands at a distance and screams and summons enemies, which you can just very easily take out with a shot to the head before it sees you. Lame. Then there's the crows, which dive bomb you. They're just kind of annoying. You burn their nests down and that's it. And then finally the big like super zombie that's super mutated is called a reacher. And it's bigger than the other ones, it's faster than the other ones. It's supposed to be like the ultimate form of the zombies. But when you first fight one, I killed it in literally 10 seconds. After the game had hyped the thing up for 10 minutes.
So fast. I didn't see it coming.
Lame. And so this game is really lacking in the enemy department. Like I said, the hordes are the most exciting part of the game, but hordes are pretty much entirely comprised of just like the basic types of enemies. I think, personally, the hordes would have been more interesting had there been more different types of enemies involved. Like, imagine if there's a front of like 10 breakers and you gotta deal with that in addition to the swarm. The most fun I had fighting in this game were the parts where a bunch of different enemies got summoned to this spot where there was a lot of noise happening. And now, I'm running around, I'm trying to figure out how to circumnavigate all these different types of zombies. Now, the combat's feeling a little more exciting. It's feeling a little more like something like Evil West, where I have to multitask and I have to look at all these different types of creatures and figure out what I need to do. That was more fun. The game should have done more of that. If they didn't want to have more variety, then at least have different permutations of the same enemies. But the game didn't even do that. The enemies just kind of show up in the same groups. 3 runners, 2 wolves, a giant swarm of the normal type. Maybe you get a breaker here and there. Maybe you get a screamer here and there. It's just something the game really should have done better with. And I understand that we're supposed to be in a pretty realistic, grounded setting with this game, right? But even with that, the game is still a game. You could still take some liberties. And besides, the premise of a super virus that spreads across the planet and mutates everything into monsters and jumps species freely is already not very realistic to begin with. Anyways, moving on to world exploration, which we've already talked about in bits and pieces. We've talked about how going out to grind will sometimes get you jumped by random groups of enemies, which are ironically some of the most exciting encounters of the game because you don't necessarily know what to expect and you do have to think on your feet. But aside from that, the world just is not that great to explore. And it's not because it's small, but it's because all there is to do in it is fight and gather. That's it. There's no mini games, there's no real interesting places to check out. The most you get are collectibles, but even the collectibles aren't very exciting because more often than not, you're going to find them by accident by gathering. So it's not like you had to do something different to go out of your way to find the collectible. You just were gathering and stumbled across it. Now this is the biggest thing I think that really hurts the early hours of this game, and is probably the reason why a lot of people put it down. All there is for you to do is go on the story missions, and every now and again you'll get a side quest that'll play out the exact same way as a story mission. Which brings me to probably the single biggest criticism that this game gets all the time, and it deserves it because it's true. The whole game, the entire game, which you'll be playing for dozens of hours, maybe even hundreds, plays out the exact same way the entire time, and the only thing that ever changes about it are your crafting recipes and the types of enemies you fight, and that is it. In this game that's going to take the average person probably between 50 and 100 hours to complete, there are only 5 types of missions. Track this person down, start the generator up, fight the horde, chase the guy on the bike, and clear the base. Now don't get me wrong, I'm a big Far Cry guy, I love clearing bases, but it doesn't change the fact that every base clear goes the exact same way. It's not like you have to do something different, sneak through the base, disable something. The one thing that's different is that I think one of the bases has a wall where you have to blow it up to get in, and that draws all the enemies to the front of the gate, so you have to approach that base a little differently. That's the one thing, the one base that is structurally distinct from the others. And don't get me wrong, the gunplay in this game is fun. The firefights feel good, the focus mechanic is extremely useful, it's well implemented. Stealth with human enemies in this game is a lot of fun too. The sight lines make sense, but they're not so unforgiving like in Dishonored where you'll just get detected instantly. So it keeps things interesting because the enemies will legitimately just find you and you can't really exploit the AI that easily. But the fights being fun just makes me wish that the bases were more different so that the fights didn't all feel the same. But anyhow, that about covers all the ups and downs of the gameplay. Overall, it's an open world where all you're really doing is fighting and gathering. The fighting is fun, the enemies, some of them are pretty cool, the random encounters out on the map can be exciting because in the survival horror context you're forced to think on your feet, limited resources, all that good stuff. But still, the game I have described up to this point is really only like a 6 out of 10. Even though the gameplay for the most part is pretty fluid and smooth and feels good, nothing I've described here is something that would make you want to sit down and play for 100 hours. That is where the story comes in. And the story is really kind of the thing that elevates this game to the point where somebody might actually want to beat it. I know that's why I beat it. So anyway, we're going to cut the episode here. And next time we'll talk about the narrative, which I feel actually did some pretty interesting and creative things in terms of pacing and managing the gamer's expectations. But for the time being, if you're somebody who played Days Gone, how did you feel about the gameplay? And if you're somebody who didn't, does this sound like something you'd want to play? See you next time.